This week, we welcome security researcher Philippe Laulheret to discuss firmware hacking, reversing, and exploitation. In the security news, turning traffic lights green with the Flipper Zero and a bunch of other hardware, suspending AV and EDR, test signing mode, Linux control freaks, hacking the Apple Studio display, Intel's attack surface reduction claim, the truth about TikTok that everyone is missing, just stop developing AI, but only for 6 months, anyone can connect to Amazon's wireless network, revoking the wrong things, losing your keys, the funny, not so funny things about firmware encryption, and exploding thumb drives. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
Coming up next on WABC, the cool and soothing sounds of the Paul Asadorian Quintet will be performing all your country favorites on unusual time signatures like 8/7 and 10/8. And with that, I give you Paul Asadorian.
Welcome to Paul's Security Weekly. This is episode number 778, being recorded on March 29th, 2023 in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. 2023. Dr. Doug is to my left. Welcome, Doctor.
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here I haven't been here in a while.
I know.
Yeah, I was drunk.
And now we're drinking martinis.
And now I'm drunk again.
You're on the same road. You're on the same path, man.
It all ends up with me in a dumpster.
That's right. I'd like to welcome Mr. Tyler Robinson to the show. It's good to have you back, buddy.
Good to be back, man.
Very nice. Are you back from vacation? You look like you're back from vacation because that's in your home, church home.
I am back.
Nice.
A little cold here. It's not warm like where I was at. But
Right,
hey.
right. Mr. Sam Bound is here with us. Sam, welcome.
Good evening. Glad to see you.
And back from the infections, Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us.
Look, pneumonia sucks is all I can say.
Did you it started with you had like an eye infection, then you got pneumonia, which is essentially a lung infection or fluid in your lungs. Is that the technical?
Do you really want the saga? Because
No,
it was
I don't.
a viral pink eye, followed by septal cellulitis, which is the eyelid of your eye swells up so bad it closes your eye.
Oh.
That's how it became bacterial. Then the bacteria basically crawled down my skull and into my body, and I got a cold. I'm like, it's just a cold, it's not a big deal. Then it became, the venue for the biggest phlegm fest the world has ever seen.
Oh my God.
Phlegm Fest 2023 with Weezer and the Brown Boys. Coughing that crap up was so much fun. Finally, I went, after seeing the ER, an optometrist, an ophthalmologist, an optometrist, a doctor, another doctor, a nurse, another nurse. Finally, somebody said, let's do a chest x-ray. And then they said, yeah, you've got pneumonia, we think, but it's atypical. I'm like, what does that mean? We don't know. So we're going to put you on stronger antibiotics.
That's medical speak for we don't know.
And then they go, have you seen The Last of Us? It's kind of like that.
Oh boy. Well, I'm glad you're feeling better, man. I was.
Thank you, sir.
After that story, I'm more worried about you than I was before.
Yeah, we're all wiping down here.
Oh my God, Josh just has pink eye. Mandy Logan is here with us. Mandy, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I am very glad to hear that Josh has come through that saga. I've wondered about when he mentioned all the multicolored phlegm. That's really stuck with me way too long. Now
our listeners are in on it, and I apologize, listeners.
Can't unsee that.
Can't unsee that stuff. A couple of quick announcements. Identiverse 2023 is heading to Vegas. Join the digital identity community at the Aria Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, May 30th through June 2nd. Identiverse is a must-attend annual event that brings over 2,500 security professionals for 4 days of world-class learning, engagement, and entertainment. As a community member, you're able to receive 20% off your Identiverse 2023 tickets using the discount code IDV23-SW20. Register today at Identiverse 2023. I also want to give our listeners a heads up on a relatively new podcast that we're doing, Eclipsium's Below the Surface. Myself and Scott Shefferman have kind of laid the foundation for the first few episodes with just Scott and I talking about some really cool threat stuff centered around firmware security. Recently, we've been recording some new episodes right here in the Security Weekly studios. Our first guest was Vincent Zimmer. And for those of you who don't know Vincent Zimmer, you should Google search him. He's one of the largest patent holders in the world, works for Intel, and had a hand in developing, among other things, UEFI Secure Boot. Also, we today sat with Nicholas Stark, who is another firmware security researcher as well, focusing on UEFI. He works for HP Enterprise, so that episode will be coming out soon. You can find out more and listen to episodes at eclipsium.com/podcast. To get the subscribe links, go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. Philippe is a security researcher who loves hacking all the things with a focus on reverse engineering and vulnerability research. Philippe uses his background in embedded security and software engineering to poke at complex systems and get them to behave in interesting ways. Philippe presented multiple projects covering hardware hacking, reverse engineering, and exploitation at conferences like DEF CON, Hardware.io, Echo Party, and more. In his spare time, Philippe enjoys playing CTF, immersing himself in the beauty of the Pacific Northwest, and exploring the creative realm of creative coding. Philippe, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting.
Philippe, it's wonderful to have you here. I feel kind of weird about some of our guests because I feel like I've internet stalked you for some time, and finally we're able to connect and reach out and get you on the show. So, Philippe, how did you get your start in information security?
So yeah, actually, it's a kind of a funny story. When I was a teenager, it's a little long story, but it's a fun one. So when I was a teenager, I would buy computer magazines, and they would come with CDs, and you have sharewares and stuff that doesn't exist anymore. And I think on one of them there were also some adult software where you could pay, call a paying number and get decryption codes and stuff. And of course I didn't want to pay, but I was like, oh, I want the images, And I started looking at that software. I didn't know anything. I tried to remove chunk of it in Word. Clearly that doesn't work. Then I learned about X editors, reverse engineering tools, and it took a couple of years to actually get where I wanted. But that kind of opened the door for this whole universe, and then I get into CTF and that kind of things.
So wait, hold on, Philippe. Mm-hmm. You discovered hacking because you wanted access to porn.
Yeah.
But I love the honesty and transparency. A lot of us are like, oh, that's he said the word porn, but a lot of us are like, yeah, we totally would have done the same thing, and maybe have in the past. So
actually,
I think I learned how to repair GIFs. I mean, yeah, and JPEGs that got cut off by a 56K modem. You learn how to repair them in the middle because, well, never mind. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, kind of the closure around that stuff was, 5 years later when I was actually able to do it, I was like, oh, I could do it for fun. It's interesting. And I was able to publish my first time I published anything in the French magazine that I was reading, back then to teach security research and stuff. And so I was able to publish in that magazine I was reading when I was younger and learning hacking. And following that, a security researcher that I will not name messaged me, and it was like, hey, by the way, when I was a few years ago, I was also into researching that kind of thing. So let me know if you want to work with with us and stuff. So it's kind of funny how things happen, and definitely other people were interested in that kind of things.
So you French researchers were collaborating on hacking to get porn. I respect that. That's.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for all the researchers.
Yeah, but at least out of one other person, the one other person, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that's
for porn.
I think you could gel down a lot of people start into hacking without the porn part. You could just literally say, because I didn't want to pay.
Yeah, because I wanted to circumvent something.
I mean, that was everybody from my era was because I don't want to pay.
Right.
Even if it wasn't pornographic, because we just had ASCII porn, which gets pretty boring pretty fast. But
wouldn't that have actually started with cable then, with cable TV?
It's true, the scramble.
Well, no, that was actually, some of the first stuff I was working on was some of those cheater boxes that were allowing you to descramble. Like, and it actually, I mean, I would tell you if it was the truth. We were just wanting to watch regular old HBO. We weren't even going for the like porn parts. We were just going, can we get HBO? Because I don't want to pay.
It's, Philippe, I don't want to distract from your interview, but when we talk about the technology behind, you've delivered a cable box to thousands of people, and you have to encrypt and decrypt their specific streams so that if they give you money, you can decrypt it for them. Behind all that is just amazing technology, actually. I mean, it kind of relates to embedded because you do have access to the embedded stuff, but there's this layer of crypto on top of it. Nate Lawson talked about it on security cryptography and whatever, and it was like amazing, eye-opening interview.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like these kind of things are like the one that also are the most secure because people are motivated to break them. Like I know in France, these kind of things were like even like based on like microchips, like
smart
the
cards
same as we have on smart cards. Yeah. And it's just like that was driving the innovation back then because that was the one that's like the most reason to protect things, and like people had also the most reason to break it because I wanted like the free channels and so on.
I think you and I may have been we might have talked about this in prep for this show about how with like a consumer IoT router whose job it is to like provide internet and Wi-Fi, and we've had these devices for ages now. There's not as much motivation to provide security as there was with the set-top box that had to protect paid content that was responsible for collecting millions of dollars over the years. And it's an interesting motivator, right?
Yeah, I mean, those incentives is like, I think some of the harder stuff are like, the TV box, the video game console, to fight piracy. And then you have like your phone and stuff that's also becoming more and more important. But I think it's really interesting how there's kind of like a survival of the fittest where the highly in-demand targets are going to become better and better, while the stuff that doesn't have as much like light shine on them because they're like not as exciting targets are like way lagging behind in terms of security because there's like little business reasons to upgrade.
Philippe, when did you first start getting into the security and bypassing the security of, I think what we called embedded? You probably did it when you called embedded systems, not IoT, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think IoT is just like the new word for like the same old stuff. It's like rebranding. When I started, I think for a long time, I was reading blogs about it because I thought it was interesting, but I was kind of afraid of the hardware because, I'm more a software person and I didn't want to break stuff. And eventually I kind of applied to like a company in New York that does like embedded security. And the job interview was like, they literally sent me like a VoIP phone, like a desk phone. And it was like, oh, there is a flag in the thing. You have a week to find it. And so I was like, okay, now it's time to actually apply like what I've read about for ages. And so, it's interesting because I feel like hardware can be scary because, you don't know. But in the end, like it's not that difficult. Like we just need to go over like the fear of like breaking stuff and getting familiar with it. But usually like it's much easier to like target some of these like easy embedded systems and like exploiting Windows, for instance.
I think one of the more intimidating things if I were to go on a job interview and they would send me a device, step one is acquiring that firmware. And to a certain extent, if it's encrypted, decrypting it, right? Like that's some of you can't really do anything without access to the firmware. Was that what it was like when they sent you the phone? Was that your kind of step one? Like, I need access to the firmware.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I try to like ping at it blindly because, like in the end, you don't want to break the stuff, the only one you have. So you
right.
It's better to start with like less invasive like methods. But yeah, I think back then it was like, it took me 6 days to actually get the firmware because at some point I was like, oh, forget it, if I break it, like it's fine, like whatever. And the last day was like actually doing like embedded research and I was like, oh, that's easy. Like it's just, doing software stuff, and I was like, oh, that's not too complicated.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Philippe. Like oftentimes once you get to the firmware, it's like, oh, if I just do strings on it, like there's the flag. Right? I mean, it's often not that simple, but sometimes it is.
Yeah, I mean, that one was like a little more complicated. I think one of the worst thing was like they had patched the MD5 function. They changed 1 byte in one of the data table. So you'd see how it's doing MD5, but if you do MD5 on your own, not on the device, it wouldn't work because there was a slightly different function. That was really nasty. But yeah, I think to access the firmware, like sometimes it's not that complicated either. Like if you solder like a few cables, you can usually get like a serial console.
Yep.
And if you can trick the system into showing you the U-boot, so that kind of like the bootloader of the whole system, if you're lucky, you can just ask U-boot to print the stuff on the screen, and it's in the end you just have to like solder 2 wires, or even just like hold them and pocket stuff, and it's not that complicated. So yeah, I think that one was like I ended up like buying like cheap like clips that I could like attach to the flash chip, and it was really annoying because every time I would move something, like one would like fall off because they were like super cheaply made. But yeah, it's not too complicated. Like when you get used to it, it's fine, I guess.
So you had to actually clip the chip to get the firmware off that device, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think the one thing was, so usually either you're going to desolder the chip and then put in a reader, but that one is like it's going to be much harder to like use the device afterwards when you move the flash. Or you can do it like in system, where you just attach to the flash chip itself, either like with like little like clips, like hooks, let's say, or you can actually have like the right size, like the right footprint, like hooked, and you just like put it on top of the chip, and that's much easier. But usually the problem with that is when you try to access the content of the chip, you need to send power to that. And if everything share the same like power bus, you can get into that situation where like the whole device try to boot, and then it doesn't work because you're trying to talk with the chip, and the device is also talking with the chip. And so in that case, I was just like, I'm going to short random shit on the board and prevent it from booting while I'm trying to read it. And that actually worked and did not break the device. So that was lucky.
Yeah. Because I know like on PCs, you can just give it usually 5 volt, but also as a caution to our listeners out there, make sure you send it the right voltage, research that beforehand. Otherwise, you can get into trouble and break your hardware. But the other trick on a PC is you can just give it power and not tell it to boot. But when you get into embedded systems, it's also tightly coupled that, like you said, Philippe, giving it power, it makes the thing boot anyway. So.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the trick for like that phone was like understanding that if you can keep the CPU in reset, so prevent the CPU from starting, that's all you need. And I think the way I approached that, I was just like, well, this device need to be programmed like in the field, like when they manufacture it. So I was like, I kind of expected to have, a way of accessing the flash directly, for like testing and pertaining to the manufacturing process. And the same you find like debug test points and whatnot, because that device was not hardened. I would not expect to find these kind of things in a set-top box that's try to protect like the IP and stuff.
Right.
But a cheap VoIP phone,
yeah. No, it's a great point. And also you couldn't access the firmware online. Right. I mean, that's obviously the easiest way. If you can go download the entire firmware image, when we're talking about embedded IoT stuff, typically the entire image is what's stored on the flash chip, so you can do that. But
yeah, I think in that case, if I recall, like you could download the firmware updates, but they were like encrypted. So you need the decryption key from the phone in order to decrypt the next firmware. So like when you hack it once, you can decrypt the other firmware, but you need to break in once first.
And usually that's the same. Is that the same key for all devices? Well, here we're separating like on your set-top box that's protecting IP versus your phone, like typically with a VoIP phone, it's the same decryption key for all the devices.
Yeah, in that case, that was like the same for everything. I remember I think there was like a funny bug where like I think it was some AES stuff and they were doing AES wrong, and they were like keep resetting the context of the encryption. So they were thinking they were doing like CBC, I think, and in the end it was just like ECB or whatever, just because bug in the code.
Right.
So, it's like this is the kind of thing nobody audits because like we would look into that. So.
And we have a story about firmware encryption too. But the thing with that is usually the key is stored somewhere in the bootloader or in a place where the bootloader can access that key. And if you can gain that level of access, you have the decryption key, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I think in that case, I think it depends if the firmware is stored like encrypted in the flash, in which case it becomes much harder, or if it's more like the when you do the firmware upgrade, the upgrader knows the key and it decrypts it like on the fly to like flash the flash. And so this is, I think, a little more common, because that would be really frustrating if you go through like all the trouble to like dump the content of the flash and realize everything is encrypted, and then you're like, oh, I need to find another way of breaking in. Right.
Philippe, how did you get into learning this stuff, and like what advice do you have for folks that want to get into the security research aspect of IoT devices today?
That's a great question. I think to me, like what was really helped was like reading a lot of blogs that talked about this type of IoT projects, and I guess also playing CTF helped to some extent. But yeah, I think to me that's the two best ways to like get specifically into IoT. Learning like the existence of the tools and the ways of apprehending this kind of things. And you also have, like firmware images. In some situation, like either the firmware is not encrypted or it's easy to decrypt or something. So, you can decouple the hardware hacking part to the, analyzing the firmware by itself. I think there's also like a damn vulnerable router thing. I share the link in the Discord.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you.
It's Samil Shah. Sorry, Doug, just Samil Shah's project. Emux. I think he also maintains the damn vulnerable. He's got damn vulnerable ARM and MIPS, and I don't know if he maintains them or if he kind of forked it from someone else. But definitely when I was looking at Samil's stuff, he had damn vulnerable images for firmware.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to ask you was, is there a device or a specific chipset or something that you could recommend to people that want to get started, like the easiest one you could think of? Because I have been asked that before by students who said, I'd really like to learn some of this.
Anything from D-Link.
Yeah, I just wondered, is there like one that's your favorite that's like the easiest one to do, compared to, say, people that just randomly grab something and then they get really frustrated because it's really, really hard or it's really, really weird? I wondered if there was an easy one.
Yeah, and I cannot think of anything specifically, but I think the way I would approach that if I was like learning and want to like get my feet wet or something would be find an interesting blog post that you can understand that's well detailed, and then just like acquire like the same device that they're talking about. So this way you could follow what's written and try on your own.
Well, I feel better. That's what I told them. That was what I told them. I was like, find a blog post and try to duplicate it.
That's been my experience too, though, is it doesn't seem like there's it's interesting you say this. I'm just like the first time I'm verbalizing this. There's not like one central place I can go to learn about this, like adsecurity.org and, Kali Linux and Metasploit, or like places I can go to learn some of the like introductory tools and methods. But when it comes to reverse engineering firmware, Philippe, I think you're spot on. I find myself doing the same thing. I go read all the blog posts and I go see how someone else picked apart this firmware. And then I go try and pick apart that same firmware and follow it. And then I go, okay, how do I apply what I learned? So when I go get new firmware, it's slightly different, but I'm applying the same concepts. I think that's totally
That's
true.
how you learn most any research. I mean, whatever it is you want to learn, if you can see somebody else doing it, you reproduce the research, that's a starting point. I mean, just reproduce it, and somebody's walking you right through how to do that, but you'll get more confident with what you're doing, I think.
Yeah, and I think something that is interesting is if you think about it, like you're going to find, like, assuming the system is not like hardened against, like any type of hardware hacking, you will find, like similar patterns, like you find debug test points, debug ports, like serial console, because all of that is part of the manufacturing process. Like if you think as a developer as opposed to like a hacker, it's like they need to test the software, they need to test the hardware, they need, like when they manufacture the board, they need to make sure that it actually works properly, for like QA testing and whatnot. And because of that, like in every like embedded device, I mean not all the embedded device, but in plenty you will find like similar stuff, and you would kind of know what to expect. Like pretty much any device I would open, I'm sure there is going to be like a serial port somewhere that gives you like a console of like at least some logs or something. So,
or a JTAG port or something similar to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like JTAG is like a hit or miss because they might disable that or it might not be soldered. Like serial console, I think is the even more so like the more common one. And because it's like literally like 2 wires, you can get like a like USB to serial adapter on like, I don't know, like Adafruit or SparkFun or whatever. You can get that, and then it's just like you plug it, and then you could see like the whole U-boot. If it's a Linux device, you would see like the thing booting, and like sometimes you even have like directly like a shell. So without too much hands-on, like if it's like it can be easy.
And sometimes those ports are inside the case too. Lou and I were taking some stuff apart, and we found that the case was solid. But when you took the case off, there was a serial port inside of it that had been covered over. They didn't want you to see it.
Oh, wait,
but
they
it was
soldered onto the serial port header an actual serial port?
Yeah, no, it was actually a serial port that was inside this box. It was a piece of music equipment. But I'm presuming it was how they actually installed stuff on there. But it was you could get into everything.
Because usually they just leave the header on the board. They don't actually bother soldering a connector on it.
No, they had a connector on there. This was old, though, so it was, it was more common then. But today,
That's pretty funny,
but you could always solder. Yeah, I was going to say, you might want to look at the board and see if you can see that serial header. You could solder your own little connector.
Well, yeah, and that's largely what we do. I mean, unless the stuff is on the chip or whatever, but it's all different. That's the hardest part about, I think, hacking into all this stuff is every piece of hardware is slightly different.
Yeah, and including the fact that they're starting to develop methodologies to actually remove those access points from a manufactured board. They now have boards that have specific weaknesses, so you snap off the JTAG or the serial connector or the whatever when it's done. And so they're trying to remove those from finished products. And actually, Philippe, I was wondering, as you've gone through this career, have you seen less and less serial ports, less and less JTAG, less and less access points, I suppose I should say, or more, or the same? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like I don't spend all of my time looking at all the devices, so to be taken with a grain of salt here. But
it's anecdotal, but please go ahead.
I feel it's I still see like serial port like all over the place, because as I said, it's part of like manufacturing process and whatnot. Probably like more modern device might be like a little more tricky with that. But I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry.
It's okay. As time has gone on, have they changed? Go ahead.
So the one thing that I've noticed was sometimes like the new tool chains or systems are like better or more secure by default. Like one time we were asked to can you like look for vulns in this like smart TV, for instance? And the smart TV, we're like, yeah, sure, we're going to dump the flash. We know how to do that. We're going to look at the stuff. We dumped the flash, and the flash was encrypted. And it was really surprising for us because the TV was cheap, like brand, and had no reason to be that secure. But it happened to be like actually like an Android TV, and because of that, like it benefited from like the whole like security stack of Android. And yeah, by default, like the flash on, like Android phone, for instance, is going to be encrypted. And because of that, the TV flash was also encrypted. So it's just like seeing like improvement of tools and just like, they didn't mean to be more secure, I would assume, but it's just like by chance, like that the tools they used and so on were more secure.
My guess, Philippe, is that they benefited from the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And they didn't really put a lot of security into their software and applications, but like the development kit that they got allowed for that to just happen to be encrypted, and they just they benefited from that until someone figured it out. But their software probably wasn't any more or less secure than anyone else.
Yeah, that would be my assumption as well. It was just like, they were lucky that the toolchain was secure,
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, I think in my experience, like in some situation dealing with, like embedded system developers, like that's might not be the expertise to be like, like secure coding practices and whatnot. Like their job is to make the device, not necessarily to be like the most secure. And so what I've seen in a bunch of places were kind of like, they try to be secure, they read about security, but they don't really know it from like an attacker perspective. So they try, but what they try is not necessarily like efficient. Like I remember I was looking at the firmware, for instance, and they were like, the login page login page was in JavaScript, and it says like adding some salt to the password of the user, and it was just like a string, like a hard-coded string that was like on the firmware side, like on the server, would just be like stripped away, like when you log in, and it was just like, and then like process normally. So like it's completely inefficient as a security measure because it's just like a hard-coded secret that, and it's definitely not a salt, but it's probably like someone who like read on Stack Overflow, oh, you need to salt your password, and so they did that, but it's not quite right. So it's like the intention, but not quite deliver properly.
Right. Yeah, I totally like. I get what you're saying in that we've kind of laid out the classifications of how they think about security. I think in the first like horrible case, they don't pay attention to it at all. They're like, my job as a developer is to make this thing work. Now, I don't want to take anything away from developers that they're doing that, because to make stuff work on a lot of this hardware, and like firmware is just software that's inconvenient to program. So like props to them, you made it work, like first of all, but they've left out security entirely. They're like, it's not my job. Then you get kind of the middle ground where they're like, I read something on Stack Overflow that I should do this thing for security and that's good. Or like, it's kind of like half baked, like just including security because it sounds like the right thing I should be doing, and they implement it poorly. And then the third class is like folks that actually paid attention to security. I think you could probably point to Microsoft's Xbox team that was like, yeah, we're developing a device, and like security was built in from the foundation and is in their culture, and it is a very secure device. I don't want to task anyone trying to hack the Xbox platform. I think there's actually been very, very few cases, like one or two. I've been doing the show 18 years, and I haven't really covered much about Xbox. I know the original Xbox had I think it was a buffer overflow in some of the early games that allowed you access to it. But in the 360, they closed that stuff down, and there was like one researcher that did some stuff. Like their platform is probably a shining example of how you should do embedded device security.
Yeah, for sure. I think like gaming console are like some of the hardest target for that reason, because people want to hack them to like play games and like piracy.
Yeah, piracy and cheat, right?
Because they don't want to pay.
It undermines their entire business model from a platform and gaming company if you're able to cheat or somehow hack the system or piracy. So piracy and cheating, it undermines their entire business model.
Cheating
so they put a lot of effort into it.
But I can't remember if like the PlayStation, like some of the PlayStation, I think it was like PS3 maybe, or maybe there was Xbox. I mean, one of these gaming consoles, they used to have like an option to boot into Linux, because I know like they were like nerds, and eventually they removed that option, and that's when like all the people doing like homebrew and stuff like that were like got really annoyed, and that's when the security researcher were like not into piracy, but are like annoyed that like you deprive them for like the Linux, or like, okay, we're going to find bugs now. Right. And so by removing that feature, that's actually called like the hackers to like target the device. So
that's awesome. There's got to be like a name for that situation where it was kind of open and they let hackers like do their thing, and then they closed it off, and the hackers got really mad and just found a bunch of vulnerabilities and bugs. That's awesome.
But that's evolution. That was what Philippe said earlier.
I think we call that revenge of the nerds.
Yeah, maybe.
That's what I would call
I mean, I mean, the gaming platforms definitely are huge targets, both for cheating and for money. And both combined, so cheating can lead to money at the same time on modern games. So I think that's evolved because they know that there's a big threat there, and they're technologically astute users, and they have a huge motivation to get in there. So it hurts the gaming company if they lose.
I always like to say there's a fine line between hacking and cheating.
Yeah.
Like there's a,
Depends on your...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, do you guys remember, like, what's called, like, Action Replay or something, or Game Genie, like, or Game Shark?
Oh
like,
my
these
God,
devices
Game Shark.
that you use to, like, enter code, to, like, have, like...
Game Genie was a Nintendo thing, right? That was the Nintendo...
TS?
I think the Game Genie was the Nintendo, and
Yeah.
I think they got sued by Nintendo
And
because...
it pushed code. Yeah, it pushes codes, right? It pushes codes into the game so you can cause weird things to happen. And
Yeah, you're literally patching memory. And
Right.
so I remember I had one on like the first PlayStation, and it was like more advanced, so you could search for your own, codes. But really, what it was doing was like it was scanning the entire memory of the PlayStation, and you were doing like kind of like memory diffing to find, like you lost a life, what has decreased, and so that was actually teaching you like hacking for sure. It's like that's what you do like as a security researcher. You like look at memory dumps and stuff, and I think it's really funny that back then like you were learning like security concepts without even knowing.
I think it's funny still that a lot of the techniques for like DLL hijacking and sideload and the research that came out of those for patching DLLs all were from game hacks and continue to be some of the bleeding edge for some of the game hacks. So those developers don't even know kind of the offensive piece that they've contributed to over the years.
Yeah, I think it's like, once again, it's like motivation, if you look at, once again, like teenagers that, have like plenty of free time and like really motivated to, win at CSGO or whatever, like they're going to learn all of that stuff so that they can, hack and win, so that's, every generation will find like motivation in their like own ways, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting, the relationship between hacking and motivation, right? It's kind of crazy to think about what if folks were highly motivated to attack different targets that they're not so motivated to attack today.
Isn't that the whole premise of like Pwn to Own and all that stuff? Is like motivate them,
motivate them with money.
You can't always motivate people to break something, like I remember trying to break Pac-Man because we could win food. So all the arcade...
Oh, back up. How does Pac-Man and food relate to each other?
Because
other than the Pac-Man is
because
eating
all of the arcades, there was like 15 arcades within like quick driving range of where I lived.
So, but for a younger audience, what's an arcade, Doug?
It was a big room full of video games, and every single arcade had a weekly prize for the high scores on devices. And me and this crew of people targeted various machines, not with necessarily hacks, but I was looking at like the source code. And I figured out a pattern to play
Doug,
Pac-Man.
how did you get this? Never mind.
I knew somebody. I used old school techniques, and I actually had a professor who worked.
You acquired the source code to Pac-Man so you could analyze it, so that you could be the high score. So, what was the winner of the high score for the week? A free meal?
Yeah, they like for a free pizza, like different, and we had a whole list of them. So there was some of them had pizza, some of them had sandwiches, some of them had. We didn't want the crap like T-shirts and stuff, but they had food. They had.
I think it's a T-shirt. Like I will hack for pizza and sandwiches.
Free pool. You could shoot pool, and they're nice pool tables for free for like 2 hours.
To be clear, Doug is willing to commit felonies for pizza.
It wasn't a felony.
Not back then. It was just.
And the statute of limitations ran out years ago on that.
See, and Doug was the smart one. He didn't just do 99999 for the high score every time. They definitely had some random numbers in there, I'm sure.
Well, and there was another money form there. In bars, you could play people for money. So just like you hustle pool, we used to hustle people on video games. So these drunk idiots would come in and they'd be like, "You look like you're pretty good at Pac-Man, buddy." Like, yeah, how much you want to play for? And then you beat them out of their cash.
You never cease to amaze me, Doug.
I think this is why we're seeing massive pushes though down the stack to the firmware level and hardware, right? You have that motivation from these APT groups, nation states to maintain hard-gained access and intelligence within inside of organizations, which often takes a lot of money, effort, and resources. And you don't want the attribution. The easiest way to continue doing that and avoid the security tools is to continually go down the stack. And the furthest place that we're seeing a lot of adversaries make real big pushes is obviously hypervisor, and then down even further to the firmware baseband.
Tyler, is that just us saying that, and I want to turn that over to Philippe, right? Like, do you find that attackers, although they could kind of push higher up in the stack, that they're meeting opposition, so they're going down to the firmware level in general in order to gain persistence, stealth, and higher privileges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mix, like from a practical standpoint, you want to adjust your level of effort to like the difficulty of the task, and so maybe you don't need like some crazy ODE if you can just fish the users. But yeah, for stealth, like I don't know, like I was there's like a report for like I forgot the name, but there's like a malware group I think called like Black Lotus.
Yes, very
that
familiar
would
with
target
Black
like
Lotus,
Draytech routers.
no, Black Lotus was the recent
researcher, maybe?
the rootkit, bootkit rather, that was for sale.
Bootkit.
Yeah, bootkit that was targeting baton drop was the vulnerability in the bootloader, and some of those bootloaders hadn't been added to the revocation list. And there's a whole story behind that. But you're right. There's another. You were saying something. It's very similar to Black Lotus. There's another group that you're.
So there was like, I mean, this like APT group or like that would target like cheap like routers, and take over the device, and from there they can like modify like the DNS settings to do like like monitoring of like what's going on the network, or like interception, can do like TCP dump, and like analyze the packets. And all of that is like, well, if your router is spawned, like how do you know? Like you won't have it's pretty hard to detect that like from like XDR or like all of the tools. Like it's really stealthy, And,
there was a group that was doing that recently, Philippe, and when this came up in my day job, I actually posted a talk that I gave, I believe, at BrewCon in 2011, where I talked about, I'm like, this is going to happen. Like, there are attackers that are going to go after these devices, and the talk was called Embedded System Hacking and My Plot to Take Over the World. And it was like, this is how you compromise people's devices. They're not going to find it, and you're able to redirect all your traffic, and you're able to, I had a whole thing, like, what do you need to take over the world? It's power, it's money, and something else. And like,
free food.
This is how you get that. Like, you can take over people's routers and across the world, and you can control what they see, what they think, what they hear. Like, it's kind of like the sneakers thing, right? Like, information is power, and you can literally control everything that happens with that person's data and internet connections by compromising their router. Fast forward to today, and that's exactly what some of these groups are doing, right? They're targeting their embedded devices because that's where all the traffic's flowing through. I mean, you said it, they're putting TCP dump on there, and they're looking at all the information that's flowing through it. I don't need to compromise their PC has like way more controls on it for security than does their Draytech router, as you presented at, what was that conference, Philippe, in France?
Oh yeah, so I talked like I happen to also hack Draytech routers, not the same as the one that was targeted by the APT, but yeah, and I talked at Hexacon in France about it.
Yeah,
and so yeah, like that research was like really funny because I was starting a new project where like I wanted to look at like edge devices. And randomly picked like Draytech. I mean, I was like searching things, and I was like, "Ooh, like Draytech sounds fun." It's like, "Oh, I can get the firmware."
Now, I'm sorry, Philippe, does Draytech make routers for France, or was that you just happened upon Draytech routers because they make it for access for people in different countries?
Yeah. It's so it's a Taiwanese brand, if I recall, and I think it's like weirdly like deployed like plans in the UK, not so much in the US.
Yep.
And like in Southeast Asia and stuff like that. But yeah, I was just like looking at various ones, and I just like randomly like landed on that, and I was like, before really starting the project, I was like, oh, maybe I should start looking if it looks vulnerable, if it looks weak. And somehow, like before I officially started the research project, I was like, oh, I found a Stack Overflow in the login page. I can. And because it's like embedded, like the stack was executable.
Yep.
There's like no SLR. And so from there, it was like, well, I can actually fully compromise the device from the login page, like assuming the login page is like, exposed to the internet.
then from there you were probably like, wait a minute, what else is possible? If I can overflow the stack from the login page, there's got to be some other stuff here.
I mean, the thing is, like at that point, I'm not auditing the device. I was just like, well, I can already fully compromise the device. It runs in different situations, like multiple routers have like it either like runs like bare metal, or one of the beefier version actually run Linux, and then I run the bare metal firmware inside QEMU, which is a really weird like setup. But I was like,
That's
okay,
weird.
sure.
Yeah.
But I was like, okay, I can take over the firmware, escape from QEMU directly to like the Linux underlying system, and everything runs as root, of course, So from there, I was like, well, I can actually take over the device, run TCP dump, and emulate like whatever like the attackers would be doing. And so I made like a demo video of it where like, yeah, from there I can, run Nmap on the network, find, like internal services that are like vulnerable to other stuff, and forward the traffic over the internet to expose, internal services, to the attacker machine. Of course, I didn't target real devices. I just bought one and, created like a demo environment in the lab. And I was like, why look for more? Like I found one that's it's already like completely compromised. So,
I found, Philippe, that emulating firmware is a huge pain in the ass. And I think this is some of the posts that I read that like someone has spent, and I think we underestimate this as a community. When we read this post, you and I, many of us on the show and listening have read these posts where they walk through, here's how I reverse engineered it, here's how I got it running in some kind of emulation, that it's like, oh, they spent an afternoon. No, they did not spend an afternoon. They spent weeks, months sometimes, to be able to understand enough and keep trying and hacking at it to be able to run it in emulation. Is that your experience as well, that like running in emulation is really hard?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm way more of a static analysis guy.
Yeah,
so usually I don't even bother, and to some extent maybe I should try harder sometimes for that. But that's funny because in the case of the Draytech router, like as I said, like one setup was actually running on Linux, and then the firmware was emulated through QEMU, like on the device itself. And I was like, well, they already gave me the QEMU, like the bash script to like.
They gave you the recipe.
QEMU.
You had the recipe already.
Yeah. And so I think the one stuff was like they had their own version of QEMU, but because it's GPL, I was able to download the patched source code that they used and just recompile QEMU, which I thought would be like trying to say PG-13 would be really annoying, but actually like it was super easy, surprisingly.
You used QEMU and recompile in the same sentence. That's dangerous.
But I mean, literally, I was just like, I went to like the GPL website, and I was like, type make, and it actually works. I was like, of all of my sense of like dev in Eva, I was like, no way that was going to be so ezy, but actually it worked. I was like, good job QEMU for being easy to compile.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you get a good hand when you're gambling, right?
No, the thing is, like, I feel like I stumbled into that project, and I was like, well, it's already done. Like, that's surprising. I mean, it did take some time, and like there's like some like encryption to like defeat and stuff, but overall, I was like surprisingly easy, and just like, yeah, I can actually emulate it. Like, I was able to hack it even before I purchased a device because, I had the firmware and I was able to emulate it like out of the box pretty much. So that was really lucky. But otherwise, yeah, I think full emulation is hard. And I think you mentioned like some tools that helps with that. And otherwise, like for me, I would just go like a more easier way. Like if I don't need to emulate the whole stuff, I could just like emulate like a function. And in that case, things like Unicorn engine is really useful for that because it supports like a bunch of architecture, and you can just like, load that thing in memory and then like execute from like that address to that address. And so that's a good for like a short proof of concept, like the device, the Draytech device was, existing in like ARM, MIPS, PPC. And I was like, I want to make sure like the MIPS version is also vulnerable. But, I didn't want to emulate MIPS because that was a lot of work. But with Unicorn, I was like able to emulate the vulnerable function and be like, oh yeah, Stack Overflow is still there. So that's good.
Oh, I see. So you could just emulate even portions of the code in using the Unicorn. Yeah. Rather, because like full system emulation is a huge pain in the ass. Firmware is a project that tackled that. Then there's a project called Firmware Analysis Toolkit, which is like a wrapper for Firmware to get it all running. And like all this emulation is hit. Sunil Shah's stuff, is it Emux? Emux, I think, is the latest iteration. And Sunil's stuff is amazing, but you have to like immerse yourself in his entire framework. And I'm like, I just want to emulate it enough to like get a web interface running. And I mean, no discredit to what everyone else has done in their respective frameworks, but they're emulating the entire system firmware. Like, I don't need to go to that level. Like in my project, I just want to emulate the web server serving up the admin web pages. But it turns out there's so many dependencies in order to do just that. Like I stopped at my research this week because I was like, oh, like it runs, but then it just spins and there's no log error messages. And I'm like, I need to emulate some kind of flash or MTD device or something in order to like, so I'd have to go then and get IDA or Ghidra and like pick apart the binary and like see where it's getting stuck and go, oh, I need to give it that. And I'm like, I gave up for now.
Yeah, I think like a way I've seen that was surprisingly efficient, I guess, for like Linux-based system is, you just get like a QEMU, system emulation and like a stock like Debian image or whatever, and then you just like copy the file, like the specific files for your the router you try to emulate. And if you're lucky, it will be able to boot and actually execute all the init script and stuff. And so, you instead of emulating the whole system like from the flash dump, like you're more like, oh, you recreate like a fake environment that's like close enough that stuff actually starts.
Yeah, like you pull the file system, you cheroot the file system, and I was doing that this week too. Yeah.
So yeah, like if you're going to cheroot, it's like you can do like QEMU like userland.
Yeah,
like in that case,
user. So it's like QEMU MIPS static, right? Is to statically run a MIPS binary on the x86, and then you cheroot that. It's funny you said. We should hang out more often. I was doing that this week. Exactly that. And like I got some stuff to run, but then other stuff was kind of just like spinning its wheels because there was a dependency on something.
Yeah, it's like busy work of like figuring out like what you need.
You're right. It's busy work. Yes, it's busy. You get an error, you Google searching. Yeah. Sorry, Josh.
That's okay. Philippe, we got a question here. Any creative coding project or site that you find noteworthy for people to learn?
Oh, for creative coding, that's an excellent question.
Wait, hold on. Philippe, define creative coding. What do you mean by creative coding?
Okay, so it's kind of like, at least I'm not sure how it is nowadays, but when I was like really doing it, that's kind of using programming to generate like art.
Okay.
Or make like artsy stuff with technology. So it's like the crossroad between art and digital technology and that kind of things.
Would that be like what's the one you use, Josh? Wall-E? Is the AI
Wally's art?
Dolly is the image.
Oh yeah.
Is it kind of like Dolly, like the AI generated images, but?
Yeah.
So kind of like I think the AI stuff is more like the modern iteration of that. The thing that I used to do, like my first job was like C++ dev for like a design studio, and I was doing a lot of that. Was programmatically like generating like artsy stuff. It's kind of like
fractals.
Yeah, exactly. Like fractals or like drawing particle system, like fluid dynamics. Like it's basically you're doing like video game graphics, but for like art instead of games.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's really interesting actually because there is an overlap between hacking and creative technologies, like this type of creative coding, because it's a bit of misusing piece of technology, and it's just like the end result is different. You're a hacker, you want to break into the system. You're a creative technologist, you want to use like a Microsoft Kinect to create an interactive system, which was never meant to be used that way by Microsoft. So I think it's really interesting, like this overlap. And yeah, I guess to answer the question, like I have a book that I really like that was called, I guess, Generative Design, which is it's German. Like the original is German, and I don't remember the name, but I think the company was who made it was called Uformative. I will put like a link in the Discord or something. But it's really nice because it's like a book like that's like thick like that explains, like how to, do like a bunch of things from like the start, like, oh, how do you pick the colors, or how do you play with fonts, or like, and it's really exciting. It's like, it's a different way. It's a way of expressing yourself through technology, which I think is really fun.
Mm. No, I get that. Sometimes when I write code, I go back and look at it and like, wow, like I kind of express myself through this code. And it's very rare for me. Usually I'm like, wow, that's a hack. Like this usually my, my impression of my code. But you're right. There's totally something there where you can very much express yourself through code, which is like really super cool. Like so much so, I think what really is kind of evidence for that for me is when I was maintaining a larger project, I could go through the code and look at a particular method and go, that was that developer, right? Like, because there was multiple developers that had contributed over time. I'm like, that code I know belongs to that person. I can just tell by reading it that that's that. And sometimes it was, I can tell, like, I know they copied it from Stack Overflow, but I can tell by the way they changed it that it was that developer, right? Like I could really get, like I would, if it was a betting game, I would win 99% of the time. And so to me, well, like I came out of that experience and I was like, people really express themselves through code. So I think you're totally onto something. Like I've never been much into like art, but I can totally see this as a kind of a transient property of being a nerd, right?
Yeah, and it's funny what you're saying about like recognizing like coding patterns and whatnot, because I feel like why people like care so much about VI versus Emacs versus whatever, or like tab versus space is like it's also like a way of expressing yourself. You're like you're like a Sega, you're a Nintendo, you're like a VI, you're a Emacs. It's kind of like similar like stuff. But yeah, creative coding is really fun. I'm really bad at drawing, but telling the computer to draw for me, that's much easier.
I relate to that. Yes. Also, Python with tabs with VI is where I'm at, and everyone else is wrong. It's really what it comes down to, right? Anyone else have questions for Philippe?
I'm curious if you have any insight or ideas on kind of at this low level where we have all of this hardware, we have IoT, we've got commercial software, all of these have firmware and chips. From the risk and supply chain kind of attack vector, do you see any emerging technology or means to begin protecting this at scale and analyzing and evaluating all of these different disparate pieces of code that may have iterations even down to the same model of product but different chips? What is your kind of take from a large scale perspective of where we get to a more secure point in time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I feel like people want to do like bill of materials and that kind of things, so that might help in being more like specific about what's in your system. I don't know. I feel like other stuff like maybe like more open design, like the RISC-V, I think RISC-V architecture, or like I believe it's like it's like open. It's really open, so like that the whole thing can be audited. Maybe that would be a way to go about it. But yeah, I'm not sure. It seems to be like a lot of black boxes, and it's like probably difficult to like really know what's going on like in other places.
Philippe, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Say it again. Sorry.
These are just 5 silly questions that we ask all of our first-time guests on the show. So you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly? There are no right or wrong answers, and we don't judge you, at least on the air. No, we don't. We don't judge. No right or wrong answers. You ready?
We judge a little bit.
Maybe a little. 3 words to describe yourself.
I don't know. French security engineer.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
My wit.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
I don't know. How I hacked the planet.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Hackers.
Yes. Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Wait, to beat my parents or to be my parents?
To be. It's a very good.
That's a good one too.
It's a very good question. It's a very good distinction. Very good
I
distinction.
kind of like that one.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents. Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise. We have a very loose. I'll give you some time to think about it. We have a very loose interpretation of celebrity. It can really be any fictitious or not fictitious character from history or real life or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know why. Like the first idea I had was like some Goku, from Dragon Ball Z, which probably like the worst father figure ever. And for my mother, I have actually really no idea.
I mean, it's 2023. It doesn't have to be mom and dad.
It could be a petri dish.
Gender, gender doesn't matter.
But I kind of like this beat my parents thing. I'm going to think about that quite a bit.
I feel like Hulk Hogan would beat my parents, and I don't know either.
Philippe, thank you so much for appearing on Pulse Security Weekly. It was wonderful having you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That was really fun.
With that, we'll take a short break and come back with the security news, where we want to make sure we take a 6-month break from all things AI. Stay tuned.